No cheers greeted us when the Alpha King finally took my hand in marriage. Instead, the scrape of steel and the heavy, suffocating silence of a conquered people filled the air. He wasn't looking for a queen. He was claiming a trophy to avenge a war my father started. I accepted his vows and swallowed his hatred, letting him believe he was breaking my spirit. What Kaelin failed to realize, however, was that you cannot break a woman who has already orchestrated her own escape. My wedding dress was heavy, spun from thick grey wool and threaded with silver that felt more like chainmail than embroidery. It was a garment built for winter and for a funeral. The great hall of Oakhaven smelled of damp stone, roasted meat, and the metallic tang of fear. My father stood beside me, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He wasn't losing a daughter today. He was paying a debt. 3 years ago, he ordered the ambush in the Red Valley. 3 years ago, Kaelin's older brother was torn apart by our vanguard. Now the war was over. We lost, and I was the treaty. Kaelin waited at the end of the hall. The Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. He didn't look like a groom. He wore blackened leather armor, scuffed and carrying the faint scent of old blood. A heavy fur cloak was pinned to his shoulders. He was a massive man, broad and imposing, with hair the color of wet ash and a jagged, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. As I walked down the aisle, the silence was absolute. No music, no whispers, just the hollow echo of my boots against the cobblestone. Kaelin's eyes locked onto mine. They were a pale, striking grey. Cold. Empty. There was no triumph in his stare, only a grim, simmering rage. I reached the altar. The High Elder stood between us, holding the ceremonial blade. "You bring the blood of the traitor," Kaelin said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like grinding stones. It was the first time I had heard him speak. "I bring the blood of my pack," I corrected, keeping my voice flat. He sneered, a slight curling of his upper lip that bared the sharp edge of an elongated canine. For now, the elder stepped forward. I held out my left hand. Kaelin held out his right. The blade sliced across my palm, sharp and stinging, before doing the same to his. Kaelin grabbed my bleeding hand. His grip was entirely too tight. Our blood mingled, dripping onto the sacred stones below. "Bound by blood, bound by earth, bound by the moon," the elder chanted, though the word sounded tired in his throat. Kaelin leaned in. His breath brushed my ear. "Your father thinks this buys him peace, Rowan. It only buys him time. And it buys me you." I didn't flinch. "I am not a currency, Kaelin. I am a consequence. Learn the difference." His grip tightened briefly, a flare of anger spiking his scent, pine, ozone, and wrath, before he dropped my hand. The ceremony was over. I was his wife. There was no feast for us. Kaelin turned on his heel and walked out of the hall, his generals falling into step behind him. He didn't wait for me. He didn't even look back. A harsh, bitter laugh bubbled up in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I gathered the heavy skirts of my grey dress and followed the man who hated me into the freezing northern night. The journey to his stronghold, the Iron Hold, took 3 days. I rode in a wooden wagon, rattling over frozen mud, surrounded by his guards. Kaelin rode at the front of the column on a massive black destrier. He never rode back to check on me. When the snow started falling, thick and biting, I pulled my cloak tighter and closed my eyes. When we finally arrived, the Iron Hold loomed out of the blizzard like a jagged black tooth against the white sky. It was a fortress built for war, not comfort. The courtyard was packed with his people. They watched me step down from the wagon. I could feel their eyes. I could hear the low, rumbling growls vibrating in their chests. They smelled my father's scent on me. They smelled the enemy. Kaelin dismounted and walked toward me. The crowd parted for him in absolute deference. He stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down as if inspecting a newly purchased horse. "Show her to the eastern tower," Kalen told a grey-haired servant woman hovering nearby. "Lock the door from the outside at nightfall." "I am your wife," I said, my voice carrying over the whistling wind. "Not your prisoner." He stepped closer. The heat radiating off his large frame was a stark contrast to the biting cold. "You are whatever I say you are, Rowan. And right now, you are a reminder. Every time I look at you, I remember my brother's corpse." "Then don't look at me," I whispered. His jaw twitched. For a second, something flashed in those dead grey eyes. Confusion, frustration. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned his back on me again. I followed the servant woman into the dark, damp belly of the iron hold. I didn't cry. Crying was for women who expected to be saved. I only expected to survive. 3 months passed. The iron hold didn't warm with the coming of spring. The damp cold just seeped deeper into the stones. I learned the rhythm of my cage quickly. The pack did not speak to me. If I entered the kitchens to find a piece of bread, the cooks would turn their backs, their conversations dying in their throats. If I walked the battlements for fresh air, the guards would shift their spears, their eyes tracking me with undisguised venom. I was the ghost of the iron hold. Kalen made sure of it. He didn't beat me. He didn't starve me. He did something far worse. He made me invisible. He only acknowledged me when he needed a prop for his revenge. When visiting alphas from neighboring packs came to pay their tributes, Kalen would summon me to the high table. He would force me to sit beside him, draped in his pack's colors, a living, breathing symbol of his dominance over my bloodline. During one such dinner, a visiting alpha named Derek had too much ale. Derek had a face like a smashed crab and a laugh that grated against the eardrums. "A pretty little prize you took from the southern cowards, Kalen," Derek slurred, slamming his horn of ale onto the heavy oak table. "Though I hear the southern bitches run cold in the bed." The hall went dead quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a snapped neck. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of tough venison with slow, deliberate motions. I could feel Kalen beside me. The air around him grew heavy, the faint smell of ozone thickening. "She serves her purpose," Kalen said. His voice was lazy, dismissive, but I could hear the tight coil of a warning beneath it. Derek didn't take the hint. He leaned across the table, his breath foul. "If she bores you, Kalen, pass her around. A traitor's daughter ought to serve the pack, don't you think?" I stopped cutting the meat. I didn't look at Kalen. I looked right at Derek. I set my knife down with a sharp clack against the wood. "The last man who spoke to me like that," I said, my voice calm, lost 3 of his fingers before he could draw his blade. "Would you like to test if the southern cowards taught me how to use a dagger, Derek?" Derek's face flushed purple. He snarled, half rising from his chair, his eyes flashing wolf yellow. Kalen moved faster than the eye could track. His hand clamped down on the back of Derek's neck, slamming the alpha's face into the wooden table with a sickening crunch. Plates shattered, wine spilled like blood across the grain. "You forget yourself," Kalen whispered, leaning over the stunned, bleeding man. "She is my wife. My revenge, not yours. Speak of her again, and I'll take your tongue." Kalen shoved Derek away. The alpha stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding nose, and hurried out of the hall. Kalen slowly sat back down. He didn't look at me. He picked up his goblet, wiped a drop of spilled wine from the rim, and drank. "I didn't need your protection," I said quietly. "I wasn't protecting you," he replied, his eyes fixed on the fire roaring in the hearth. "I was protecting what is mine. You are property of the iron hold, Rowan. Nothing more." I nodded slowly, the bitterness settling in the back of my throat like ash. "Right. Property. That night, for the first time since our wedding, Kaelin came to my chamber. I was sitting by the small fire, brushing the tangles out of my damp hair. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and he stood in the frame. The flickering light cast deep shadows across his scarred face. He looked exhausted. The heavy burden of leading a traumatized pack weighed on his broad shoulders. He stepped inside and closed the door. He didn't speak. He just walked toward me. I stood up, clutching the hairbrush like a weapon. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face blank. He stopped inches from me. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over my cheek before his fingers brushed against the line of my jaw. His touch was shockingly warm. "Why do you defy me?" he asked. The roughness in his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, ragged exhaustion. "Why don't you just break?" "Because if I break, my father wins," I said simply. "And if I break, you win. I refuse to give either of you the satisfaction." His thumb traced my cheekbone. His eyes flickered down to my lips, and for a fraction of a second, the Alpha King vanished. I saw a man who was tired of being angry, a man who was horribly, painfully lonely. He leaned in. I stopped breathing. The scent of him, pine and rain, enveloped me. But then he stopped. He pulled his hand back as if I had burned him. The walls slammed back down behind his eyes. "Sleep, Rowan," he muttered, stepping away. "Tomorrow we ride to the borders." He left the room, the heavy lock clicking into place behind him. I stood by the fire for a long time, the warmth of his touch fading into the cold reality of my cage. He was a man fighting a war inside himself, but I knew better than to wait for a casualty to save me. The first snows of true winter hit the iron hold like a hammer. The fortress turned into a tomb of ice. Survival meant staying close to the hearths and keeping your head down. For weeks after the incident in the hall, Kaelin actively avoided me. He took hunting parties out for days at a time, coming back frostbitten and smelling of fresh kills. When he was in the keep, he surrounded himself with his inner circle. Among them was Lyra. Lyra was the daughter of Kaelin's lead general. She was tall, fierce, and possessed a wild, untamed beauty, and she made no secret of her desire for the king. In another life, she would have been his queen. The pack adored her. She was one of them. I watched them from the balconies. I watched how she laughed at his sparse jokes. I watched how she casually touched his arm when they pored over maps in the war room. Kaelin never pulled away from her. It shouldn't have hurt. I didn't love him. I hated him. Yet, seeing him allow someone else into his space, seeing him show a sliver of humanity to a woman who wasn't a hostage, twisted a dull, rusted blade in my gut. The breaking point arrived on the eve of the winter solstice. The great hall was packed, the fires blazing high. Ale flowed freely, and the tension of the brutal winter was temporarily forgotten in the heat of dancing and singing. I sat at the edge of the high table, nursing a cup of spiced wine. Lyra stood near Kaelin's chair. She was flushed, her eyes bright with drink and ambition. She leaned down, whispering something in Kaelin's ear. He didn't smile, but he didn't shove her away either. I stood up. I couldn't breathe in the hall anymore. The air was too thick, too heavy, with the scent of a pack that wished I was dead. I slipped out a side door and stepped into the open courtyard. The freezing air hit my lungs like shattered glass, but it cleared my head. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, burying the cobblestones. I didn't grab my cloak. I just needed a minute. "Running away, little wolf?" I turned. 2 men from the pack's guard had followed me out. I recognized them. Thorn and Vane. They were fiercely loyal to Lyra's father. "I'm taking a walk," I said, my voice steady, despite the shiver racking my spine. "Go back to your ale." Thorn stepped closer, blocking my path to the door. "We don't want you here. The king doesn't want you here. You're a stain on this keep." "Take it up with your king, then," I snapped, trying to sidestep them. Vane grabbed my arm. His grip was bruising, his claws pricking through the thin wool of my dress. "Maybe we just take care of the problem for him. A tragic fall from the eastern battlements. The ice is slippery tonight." Panic flared, hot and sharp. I yanked my arm, but his grip held. I brought my heel down hard on his boot. Vane cursed, loosening his hold just enough for me to wrench free. I backed away, my bare hands curling into fists. "Touch me again, and I'll tear your throat out," I hissed, leaning into my own wolf instincts, my eyes flashing. The heavy courtyard door slammed open. Kalen stood there. The light from the hall spilled out onto the snow, casting his massive shadow over us. "What is happening here?" Kalen's voice was lethal, cutting through the howling wind. The guards instantly dropped to one knee, baring their necks in submission. "My king," Thorn stammered. The southern woman was... She was disrespecting the guard. We were merely guiding her back inside. I looked at Kalen. My breathing was ragged, my arm throbbing where Vane had grabbed me. I waited for him to do what he did with Derek. I waited for the wrath. I waited for him to defend his wife. Kalen looked at the guards. Then he looked at me. He saw my shivering frame, the torn fabric at my sleeve, the defensive posture of my body. He turned his eyes back to the guards. "Get out of my sight, both of you." They scrambled away, vanishing into the snow. Kalen stood in the doorway, staring at me. He didn't come out into the cold. He didn't ask if I was hurt. "You bring chaos wherever you walk, Rowan," he said quietly. My heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "They threatened to throw me off the battlements, Kalen. And what did you do to provoke them?" The words hit me harder than any physical blow. I stared at him, the man I was bound to, the man who had seen the truth of the situation and deliberately chose to look the other way. He was punishing me. Still. Always. "I existed," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that. "Go to your room," he commanded, his face a mask of stone. "You are embarrassing yourself." He turned around and walked back into the warmth of the hall, shutting the heavy door behind him. I stood alone in the dark, the snow quickly settling on my hair and shoulders. The cold was sinking into my bones, but I couldn't feel it anymore. The last tether keeping me tied to the iron hold snapped. Kalen wasn't a conflicted man hiding a soft heart. He was a tyrant drowning in his own vengeance, and he was perfectly content to let me drown with him. I looked up at the eastern battlements. Vane was right. The ice was slippery tonight. It was a terrible night to travel. It was a perfect night to disappear. I walked past the door to the great hall, heading toward the stables. I wasn't running away because I was broken. I was running away because I was finally awake. The Alpha King wanted his revenge? He could have it. But he would have it entirely alone. The stables smelled of wet straw, manure, and the nervous sweat of resting animals. It was a stark, grounding contrast to the sharp, terrifying adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't take a warhorse. A destrier would need too much food and draw too much attention. I found a shaggy, thick-barreled roan gelding in the back stalls. He was a pack animal, built for endurance, not speed. Perfect. My fingers were already stiffening from the cold, fumbling with the heavy leather straps of the saddle. I worked in the pitch black, relying entirely on touch. If I lit a lantern, the watch on the inner wall would see the glow. I moved mechanically. Survival strips away the luxury of panic. I found a heavy riding cloak discarded over a hay bale. It smelled like stale sweat and wet dog, but it was lined with thick sheepskin. I wrapped it around my shoulders, pulling the hood deep over my face. From the tack room, I stole a flint, a coiled rope, and a half-empty sack of dried venison. I led the roan out the rear stable doors. The wind ripped the breath from my lungs the moment we stepped into the open. The snow was falling horizontally now, a white wall of blinding fury. The fortress gates were closed, but I didn't need them. The iron grating over the eastern aqueduct had rusted through 2 winters ago. I had noticed it on my walks along the battlements. A small oversight, a fatal flaw. I guided the gelding down the steep, icy embankment. He slipped twice, his hooves scrabbling desperately against the frozen mud, but he kept his footing. I squeezed through the rusted bars, pulling the horse through the narrow gap. The metal bit into my hips, tearing my dress, but I didn't feel the pain. I mounted the horse and kicked his flanks. We plunged into the howling dark. I didn't look back at the iron hold. There was nothing there to miss. Morning broke over the northern reaches like a bruised eye, pale, yellowish light filtering through a thick canopy of grey clouds. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh, undisturbed snow. Kalen woke with a dull ache behind his eyes. He sat up in his massive bed, the furs pooling around his waist. The fire had died in the hearth, leaving his chambers bitterly cold. He rubbed his face, the rough stubble scratching against his palms. The memory of the previous night surfaced slowly. The great hall, the ale, the guards in the courtyard. Rowan's face, pale, defiant, shivering. I existed. He swung his legs out of bed, his jaw tightening. She provoked people. She refused to lower her head, refused to act like the conquered prize she was. It was her own fault the guards targeted her. He dressed quickly in his leathers and boots. He would go to her room. He would assert his dominance. He would remind her of the hierarchy of the Ironhold. Kalen strode down the damp stone corridors, his heavy footfalls echoing. The guards outside her tower bowed their heads as he passed. He didn't acknowledge them. He reached her heavy oak door. The heavy iron lock was engaged from the outside. He slid the bolt back with a loud clank and pushed the door open. "Rowan," he barked, stepping into the gloom. Silence answered him. The room was freezing. The hearth was filled with cold ash. The narrow bed was perfectly made, the coarse grey blankets untouched. Kalen stopped in the center of the room. His wolf, usually a simmering, controlled presence in the back of his mind, suddenly paced forward, nose testing the air. Stale. Her scent, rain and southern wildflowers, was faint. Fading. "Rowan?" he said again. The harshness in his voice faltered. He checked the small washroom. Empty. He checked the heavy oak wardrobe. Her few meager dresses hung limply. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the base of his skull. It wasn't the panic of a man losing his property. It was a visceral, primal alarm. He spun on his heel and marched back into the corridor. "Where is she?" Kalen grabbed the nearest guard by the throat, pinning him against the stone wall. The man's boots dangled inches off the ground. "My K-King," the guard choked out, his eyes wide with terror. "My wife! Where is she?" Kalen's voice dropped to a lethal growl. She never came out, sire. The door was locked all night, I swear it." Kalen dropped him. The man crumpled to the floor, coughing violently. Kalen ran. He didn't walk. The Alpha King sprinted through his own fortress, ignoring the shocked stares of his people. He hit the courtyard doors and shoved them open. The blinding white of the snow glared back at him. He went straight to the stables. The stable master, a greying man named Gareth, was frantically tallying horses with a piece of charcoal. "Gareth," Kalen snapped. Gareth jumped, dropping the charcoal. "Alpha, I was just about to report to the captain." "Report what?" Kalen closed the distance between them, his chest heaving. "A horse is missing. The old roan gelding. And a riding cloak. Some rations." Gareth swallowed hard, refusing to meet the king's eyes. "The tracks. They lead toward the eastern aqueduct. But the storm, sire. The snow buried them hours ago. Kalen stood frozen. The stable smelled of hay and animals, but all he could smell was his own rising dread. The ice is slippery tonight, the guard had said. She didn't jump. She ran. She stepped into a blizzard that killed grown men in an hour, entirely alone, rather than spend one more night under his roof. The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered back a step, bracing his hand against a wooden support beam. The wood cracked under his grip. He had wanted to break her. He had wanted her to beg. But she hadn't broken. She had simply assessed her life with him, found it utterly worthless, and walked into the freezing maw of death to escape it. "Summon the hunting party," Kalen said. His voice was entirely hollow. Now. The northern reaches were a graveyard of white. Kalen led the tracking party himself. He stripped out of his armor, ignoring the biting cold, and let the shift take him. The cracking of bone and tearing of muscle was a welcome distraction from the deafening silence in his head. He landed on 4 paws, a massive, scarred wolf the color of wood smoke. 10 of his best trackers flanked him. They moved in absolute silence. The snow was thigh-deep on a man, chest-deep on a wolf. Progress was brutally slow. Kalen kept his nose to the ground, searching desperately for a single thread of her scent. The storm had scoured the land clean. There was nothing but the sharp, sterile smell of ice. They found the roan gelding 2 miles past the tree line. The horse lay on its side in a snowdrift. Its front left leg was snapped at a sickening angle. It had been dead for hours, its body stiff and dusted with fresh powder. Kalen shifted back into his human form, ignoring the freezing wind on his bare skin. He knelt beside the animal. There was no blood on the saddle. She hadn't been attacked. The horse had simply stepped into a hidden badger hole beneath the snow and broken its leg. "She's on foot," Gareth murmured, standing behind the king. "With the snow this deep. Sire, she wouldn't make it a mile." "Shut up," Kalen snarled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous resonance. "Find her trail." They fanned out. Hours bled into the afternoon. The pale sun offered no warmth, only a glaring reflection of the endless white. Kalen's hands were numb. His bare feet were turning blue, but he refused to dress. He deserved the cold. He welcomed the pain. "I wasn't protecting you," he had told her. "You are property." The memory of his own words tasted like ash in his mouth. He remembered the way she had looked at him by the fire, not with fear, but with a quiet, profound exhaustion. She hadn't asked him for mercy. She had just asked him why he wouldn't let her go. "Alpha!" A shout echoed from the east. Kalen bolted toward the sound. One of his trackers was standing at the edge of the Whitewater River. The river was a jagged, violent thing. The edges were frozen solid, but the center was a churning black torrent of freezing water that cut through the landscape like a knife. The tracker was pointing at a cluster of rocks near the bank. Kalen scrambled down the embankment, slipping on the slick ice. He reached the rocks, snagged on a sharp outcrop of stone. Half submerged in the rushing black water was a scrap of heavy grey wool. It was trimmed with sheepskin. Kalen reached out with shaking hands. He pulled the fabric free. It was soaked through, freezing instantly as he held it in the air. He brought it to his face. Faint, hidden beneath the metallic smell of the river, was the ghost of her scent. Rain and wildflowers. He stared at the churning water. The current was lethal. If she had tried to cross, if she had slipped on the icy rocks, she would have been pulled under in seconds. The heavy clothes would have dragged her down to the muddy bottom. The cold would have stopped her heart before she even ran out of air. "Search the banks," Kalen whispered. "My king," the tracker said gently. "If she went in, the river empties into the deep gorge 3 miles down. We won't find a body until the spring thaw." Kalen didn't move. He clutched the freezing scrap of wool to his chest. His wolf howled inside his mind, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore at the edges of his sanity. He had driven her to this. He had taken a proud, resilient woman and forced her into a corner so dark she preferred the freezing black depths of the white water over him. The search party returned to the iron-hold in the dead of night. Kalen didn't speak. He walked past his generals, past the whispered questions of his pack. He went straight to the war room, locking the heavy doors behind him. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the massive map table. He saw the borders he had fought so hard to secure. He saw the markers of his revenge. It all looked like garbage. With a roar that tore his throat raw, Kalen grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table and flipped it over. Maps scattered like dead leaves. Carved wooden markers shattered against the stone floor. He grabbed a chair and smashed it into the hearth. He tore the tapestries from the walls, his hands bleeding as he ripped the heavy fabric. He dismantled his own sanctuary until there was nothing left but splinters and ruin. Then he collapsed. The Alpha King fell to his knees amidst the wreckage. He didn't cry. His grief was too deep, too jagged for tears. He pressed his face into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, dry heaves. An hour later, the door unlocked. Lyra slipped into the room. She surveyed the destruction with wide eyes, then looked at the broken man on the floor. She walked over to him, her steps soft, and knelt by his side. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his broad shoulder. "Kalen," she whispered. She was a southern traitor. "You did what you had to do. The pack is still here. I am still here." Kalen went rigid. The touch of her hand felt like burning acid. He turned his head slowly. His pale grey eyes were bloodshot, completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a starving, cornered predator. "Take your hand off me," he said. The quietness of his voice was terrifying. Lyra flinched, pulling her hand back. "I know what you meant." Kalen stood up slowly, towering over her. "You think this is a victory? You think the space she left is yours to fill?" Lyra's face hardened. She didn't belong here. She brought nothing but tension to this pack. "She brought the only truth I've heard in 3 years," Kalen roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls. She looked at me and saw exactly what I am, a monster holding on to ghosts. She was the only one who didn't cower, the only one who didn't lick my boots, and I killed her for it. He stepped closer to Lyra, forcing her to tilt her head back. "Get out. If I see you in my keep again, I will strip your rank and banish you to the wastes. Get out." Lyra scrambled to her feet, her face pale with shock and humiliation. She turned and fled the room. Kalen stood alone in the ruins. He walked over to the corner where he had dropped the frozen scrap of grey wool. He picked it up, holding it in his large, scarred hands. He sank to the floor, leaning his back against the cold stone wall. He closed his eyes, pressing the fabric to his mouth. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King prayed. He didn't pray to the ancestors. He didn't pray for strength. He begged the moon, bargained with the earth, pleading for a second chance he knew he would never get. 4 months later, the mining town of Highcross sat on the neutral borderlands, a miserable collection of wooden shacks and mud streets permanently stained black from coal dust. It wasn't a place for packs or royalty. It was a place for desperate people who didn't want to be found. I wiped down the scarred wooden bar of the Rusty Pick Tavern with a rag that smelled heavily of cheap ale and lye. My hands were rough, the skin calloused and peeling from endless scrubbing. I was missing half of my left pinky toe, the toll the long walk through the snow had taken before a human fur trapper had found me collapsed near the gorge. I didn't mind the physical changes. My reflection in the cloudy bar mirror showed a stranger. My hair was chopped short with a rusted knife, hacked away to keep it from matting with grease. My skin was pale and unwashed, layered with a daily smear of ash and pine needles to mask any lingering scent of a wolf. I wasn't Rowan anymore. I was Cora, a mute runaway with a strong back and a terrifying scowl. The tavern was loud. Miners crowded the tables, their faces streaked with soot, shouting over the din of a badly out-of-tune fiddle. The air was thick with smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of cheap liquor. It was disgusting. It was perfect. "Hey, mute girl," a voice bellowed from a corner booth. I looked up. A hulking miner with a thick, greasy beard slammed his empty tankard onto the table. "More ale, and bring it with a smile this time, or I'll come back there and carve one on your face." His friends laughed, a cruel, wheezing sound. I didn't react. I pulled a fresh tankard from the shelf, filled it from the heavy wooden keg, and walked around the bar. My heavy boots made no sound against the floorboards. I set the ale down in front of him. I didn't smile. The miner scowled. He reached out, his thick, dirt-caked fingers wrapping roughly around my wrist. I said, "Smile." I looked at his hand holding my wrist, then I looked at his eyes. I didn't pull away. I didn't struggle. With my free hand, I calmly picked up the heavy iron fire poker resting against the hearth next to their table. I didn't raise it like a weapon. I just held it, letting the heavy, soot-stained iron rest casually against the man's knuckles. I stared into his eyes. I let the absolute, freezing void of the iron-hulled surface in my gaze. I let him see the woman who had walked into a blizzard to die. The miner's laughter died in his throat. The heat drained from his face. He looked at the iron poker, then back at my eyes. Slowly, carefully, he uncurled his fingers and pulled his hand back. I set the poker down, turned on my heel, and walked back to the bar. I didn't look back. Survival wasn't about fighting. It was about making people realize you had nothing left to lose. Back in the northern reaches, spring had finally thawed the frozen earth, but the iron-hold remained locked in a perpetual winter. Calen sat on his throne in the great hall. The throne was carved from ancient oak, imposing and severe. Calen looked entirely swallowed by it. He had lost weight. His heavy armor hung loosely on his frame. The dark circles under his pale grey eyes looked like bruises. The pack walked softly around him, terrified of the unpredictable, silent ghost their king had become. There were no more feasts. There was no more laughter. Calen ruled with a terrifying, absolute efficiency, completely devoid of passion. The heavy hall doors groaned open. A guard approached the throne, kneeling quickly. "My king," the guard said, keeping his eyes firmly on the floor. "A mercenary has arrived at the gates. He claims he has information regarding the border skirmishes near the neutral zone. He demands an audience." Calen rested his chin on his hand. "Let him speak to the captain." He insists on seeing you, sire," the guard stammered. "He says he brought something you might want to buy." Calen let out a slow, ragged breath. He stood up, the movement lethargic. "Send him in. If he wastes my time, take his hands." A few moments later, a man swaggered into the hall. He was clad in mismatched leather armor, smelling of cheap wine and horse sweat. He had a calculating, rat-like face and a wicked scar across his nose. He didn't bow. "Alpha," the mercenary greeted, flashing a yellow-toothed grin. "They call me Jax. I travel the southern edge, hear things, see things. Get to the point, Jax," Calen rumbled, his voice scraping like rusted iron. Jax held up his hands placatingly. Right. Business? Well, I was drinking in a mud hole called High Cross a few weeks back. Filthy place, full of humans digging rocks." Calen turned away, walking toward the hearth. "I don't care about human mining towns." "Maybe not," Jax said loudly, watching Calen's back. "But I saw something interesting in their tavern. A barmaid, supposedly a mute human. Kalen didn't turn around. A human barmaid. You brought me news of a barmaid. Guard! The guard stepped forward, their spears lowering. Wait! Jax shouted, taking a step back. Listen to me. 2 miners tried to grab her. Big men. I watched her disarm one and break the other's kneecap. It wasn't tavern brawling, King. It was military. Pack fighting. Kalen stopped. The fire cracked in the hearth, and her scent was masked. Jax continued, talking fast now. Ash and pine. Classic trick, but the wind shifted when the door opened. For a split second, I smelled rain. Kalen slowly turned around. The dead, empty look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a terrible, consuming fire. Jax swallowed hard, suddenly realizing he might have walked into a cage with a starving beast. She had short, hacked hair, looked like she'd been dragged through hell. But her eyes, they were silver grey, coldest eyes I've ever seen on a woman. The silence in the hall was deafening. The air grew heavy, the faint, ozone smell of an alpha's aura pressing down on everyone in the room. Kalen crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Jax by the front of his leathers, lifting the mercenary entirely off his feet. If you are lying to me, Kalen whispered, his face inches from the terrified man, I will peel your skin off while you watch. I swear it on my mother's grave, Jax choked, clawing at Kalen's iron grip. The Rusty Pick Tavern, High Cross, I swear it. Kalen dropped him. Jax hit the floor, scrambling backward. Kalen didn't look at the mercenary. He didn't look at his guards. He looked at the heavy oak doors leading out of the hall. His heart, which had been a dead, frozen stone in his chest for 4 months, slammed against his ribs with a violent, painful rhythm. She's alive. The thought was a lightning strike. It incinerated the grief, leaving only a desperate, frantic need. Saddle my horse, Kalen roared, his voice shaking the heavy iron chandeliers above. Saddle my horse, right fucking now. The ride to High Cross took 4 days. Kalen did it in 2. He rode his black destrier until the beast was frothing at the mouth, leaving his guards miles behind in the snow-choked passes. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. The fire in his chest kept him entirely, terrifyingly awake. Every shadow looked like her. Every gust of wind carried the phantom scent of rain. High Cross was exactly as Jax had described. A rotting wound of a town, clinging to the side of a stripped mountain. The rain here wasn't clean. It fell in thick, greasy sheets, washing the coal dust off the roofs and turning the streets into deep, black bogs. Kalen dismounted at the edge of town. His armor was caked in frozen mud. His cloak was heavy with water. He looked less like a king and more like a warlord returning from a slaughter. The few miners braving the storm took one look at his pale, manic eyes and the massive sword strapped to his hip and immediately crossed the street. He found the Rusty Pick by the noise. It was a low, sagging building, the windows thick with grime, radiating the smell of stale beer and burning peat. Kalen pushed the door open. The rusted hinges screamed. The tavern was packed, but the laughter died instantly. Silence rolled through the room like a physical wave. Men with soot-stained faces slowly lowered their tankards, their hands drifting toward the hunting knives on their belts. An alpha's presence is impossible to hide. It presses on the lungs. It demands the lowering of eyes. Kalen ignored them. His gaze swept the room, cutting through the thick smoke. And then he saw her. She was standing behind the bar, wiping down the scarred wood with a dirty rag. Her back was to him. She wore a faded brown tunic, miles too big for her, belted at the waist with a frayed piece of rope. Her dark hair, once long and shining, was hacked off jaggedly at the jawline. Kalen's breath hitched. His heart stopped, restarted, and then battered against his ribs with bruising force. He walked toward the bar. The miners scrambled out of his way, practically climbing over each other to clear a path. His heavy boots thumped against the floorboards. She didn't turn around. She kept wiping the same spot on the wood, her shoulders set in a hard, rigid line. Kalen stopped at the edge of the bar. He was shaking. The Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, a man who had waded through fields of his enemy's blood without blinking, was trembling. "Rowan," he breathed. The name scraped his throat raw. It sounded like a prayer. She stopped wiping the bar. She slowly turned around. Kalen braced himself for the anger. He expected her to scream. He expected her to throw something at him, to curse his name, to shift and attack him. He would have welcomed it. He would have taken her claws to his face and thanked her for the pain. But she did none of those things. Rowan looked at him. Her silver-grey eyes, the eyes that had haunted his every waking nightmare for 4 months, were completely empty. There was no rage, there was no fear, there was just a chilling, absolute indifference. "My name is Cora," she said. Her voice was rough, unpracticed. "You're tracking mud onto my floor." Kalen physically recoiled as if she had struck him. "Rowan, please, it's me. I thought you were dead." "I am dead," she replied, picking up a stack of dirty wooden bowls. "Rowan died in the Whitewater River. I suggest you go back and look for her there." "I found your cloak," he said, his voice cracking. He reached out, his hand hovering over the bar, desperate to touch her, desperate to prove she was real. "I tore my keep apart. I tore myself apart. I have looked for you every single day." Rowan set the bowls down. She leaned against the bar, looking at him the way one looks at a particularly annoying drunk. "And now you found me," she said flatly. "Congratulations. The Ironhold's property has been located. Are you going to drag me out by my hair, King? Or are you going to let me finish my shift first?" The word property hit him like a warhammer. "I'm not here to drag you anywhere," Kalen choked out. "I'm here to bring you home, as my wife, as my queen." Rowan let out a short, harsh laugh. It held zero humor. "Queen, right, the queen of a tomb, the queen of a pack that spits in my food and threatens to throw me off the walls while you watch." She leaned closer, the smell of lye and cheap ale failing to completely mask her true scent. "I would rather scrub the vomit off these floorboards for the rest of my life than spend one more night in your gilded cage, Kalen. Go home." She turned her back to him again and walked toward the kitchen. "Rowan!" he shouted, the Alpha command slipping into his voice, rattling the bottles on the shelves. She stopped in the doorway. She slowly looked over her shoulder. The indifference was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal fury. "Don't you ever use that tone with me again," she snarled, her upper lip curling. "You broke the bond the night you let me walk into that storm. You have no claim here. Get out." She disappeared into the kitchen. Kalen stood alone at the bar. The entire tavern was watching him. He could feel their terror, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care about dominance. He looked down at his trembling hands. She was alive. But he had lost her entirely. Kalen didn't leave Highcross. He walked out of the rusty pick, crossed the muddy street, and sat down on a wooden bench under the rotting awning of a closed blacksmith's shop. The rain continued to fall, soaking his hair, dripping down his scarred face. He sat there as the sun set, turning the mud black. He sat there as the miners stumbled out of the tavern, giving him a wide, terrified berth. He stayed there all night. By morning, the town realized the warlord wasn't leaving. The tavern owner, a sweating, nervous man named Cobb, approached Kalen with a plate of bread and hard cheese. "My lord," Cobb stammered, bowing so low his nose nearly brushed the mud. You cannot stay here. It's bad for business." Kalen didn't look at the food. He looked at the tavern door. "I'm not leaving. She won't see you, sire. Cora, Rowan, whoever she is. She slipped out the back last night, rented a room above the tannery. She told me to tell you that if you follow her, she'll disappear again. And this time, you won't find a cloak." Kaelin's jaw clenched. The threat was real. He knew she would do it. "Then I will wait here," Kaelin said softly. "I won't approach her. I won't speak to her unless she speaks to me. But I am not leaving." For 3 weeks, the Alpha King became a fixture of the filth. He stripped off his heavy armor, trading it to the local mercer for a simple wool tunic and a thick cloak. He rented a small, drafty room above the blacksmith. When Rowan walked to the tavern for her shift, Kaelin sat on his bench and watched her. He noted the slight limp in her step, a missing toe from frostbite Cobb had drunkenly confessed. It was a permanent, physical reminder of Kaelin's failure. Rowan ignored him with practiced perfection. She never looked his way. She never faltered. She carried heavy kegs, broke up bar fights with a fire poker, and wiped down the tables. Kaelin watched her build a life out of scrap. He watched her smile, a small, rare thing, at a young miner who tipped her an extra copper. He watched her slip a piece of bread to a stray dog in the alley. He saw the woman she actually was, the woman he had deliberately blinded himself to because she bore the scent of his enemy. He was drowning in his own regret, but he didn't push. He respected her boundary. It was the first time he had ever respected her. The uneasy truce broke on a moonless Tuesday night. Kaelin was sitting on his bench, whittling a piece of pine, when the scent hit him. It wasn't the smell of coal or sweat. It was wet fur, iron and rotting meat, rogue wolves, 4 of them. They weren't local. They carried the faint, bitter scent of the northern borderlands. Kaelin stood up, dropping the wood. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. They were moving fast, slipping through the shadows behind the tavern. Kaelin didn't shout. He drew his sword, the steel singing in the damp air, and sprinted across the mud. He kicked the back door of the tavern open just as the first scream tore through the kitchen. Rowan was backed against the stone hearth, a heavy meat cleaver gripped in her hand. 3 massive men stood in front of her. They hadn't shifted, but their eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the dim light. Kaelin recognized the leader immediately. Vane, the guard he had banished the night Rowan ran away. Vane's face was horribly scarred from the frostbite, half of his nose missing. He had survived the wastes, found some rogues, and tracked the king. "Well, well," Vane sneered, his eyes fixed on Rowan. "General Varg pays good silver for the head of the southern bitch. Said it would cure the king's depression to finally have closure." Rowan didn't flinch. She raised the cleaver higher. "Come and claim it, Vane. I'm missing a toe. I could use a few of yours to balance it out." Vane lunged. Kaelin hit him like a freight train. The king didn't bother shifting. He grabbed Vane by the back of his leather collar, lifted him effortlessly, and slammed him headfirst into the heavy wooden chopping block. Wood splintered. Bone cracked. Vane crumpled to the floor, instantly unconscious. The other 2 rogues spun around, drawing jagged, silver-coated daggers. They recognized Kaelin, but they were desperate, starving men. They attacked in unison. "Kaelin left!" Rowan shouted. Kaelin ducked a wild slash, driving the pommel of his sword into the first rogue's temple. But the second rogue was faster. He slipped under Kaelin's guard, his silver dagger flashing in the firelight. Kaelin could have dodged it. He could have stepped back. But Rowan was standing directly behind him. If the blade missed Kaelin, it would find her. Kaelin didn't move. He took the strike. The silver blade plunged deep into Kaelin's side, sliding between his ribs. The burn was instantaneous and agonizing. Silver to a wolf felt like liquid fire. Kaelin let out a low, guttural roar, dropping his sword. He grabbed the rogue by the throat with both hands, his eyes flashing brilliant, dominant white, and snapped the man's neck with a single, vicious twist. The rogue dropped dead. Kaelin staggered. The world tilted sideways. He looked down at the hilt of the dagger protruding from his ribs. Black veins were already creeping across his skin, the silver poisoning his bloodstream. He fell to his knees, his breathing ragged. Rowan dropped the cleaver. She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the dead men, then at the king bleeding out on her kitchen floor. "You stupid, stubborn bastard," she whispered. She didn't run away. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound. Kaelin looked up at her. His vision was blurring, the edges of the room turning dark. He reached out with a trembling hand, his bloody fingers gently brushing against her cheek. This time she didn't pull away. "I protected what is mine," Kaelin choked out, a bloody smile touching his lips. "And you are not my property. You are just mine." His eyes rolled back, and the Alpha King collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The pain was a living thing. It chewed through his veins, setting his nerves alight. Kaelin drifted in and out of consciousness. He smelled blood, he smelled burning herbs, and above it all, he smelled rain and southern wildflowers. When he finally opened his eyes, the light was dim. He was lying on a narrow, lumpy cot in a room that smelled heavily of leather and tanning chemicals. Rowan's room. His shirt was gone. His side was bandaged tightly with clean linen, stained a dark, rusty red. The burning of the silver was gone, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. Rowan was sitting in a rickety wooden chair by the small window, watching the rain fall. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were stained with dried blood. "You pulled the silver out?" Kaelin rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. Rowan turned her head slowly. She didn't smile. "Cobb helped me carry you up here. You've been unconscious for 2 days. The silver infection almost stopped your heart." "Why didn't you let it?" he asked quietly. Rowan looked back out the window. "Because I don't want your ghost following me around, Kaelin. I have enough ghosts." Kaelin tried to push himself up, biting back a groan as his stitched muscles pulled. He managed to prop himself against the headboard. "I was wrong," Kaelin said. The words hung in the small, drafty room. They were heavy. Rowan looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "I was wrong about everything," Kaelin continued, his voice steady despite the weakness in his body. "When my brother died, the anger was the only thing that kept me breathing. When the war ended, I didn't know how to live without the rage. So I directed it at you." He looked down at his hands. "I saw how strong you were. I saw how you refused to break, and it terrified me. Because if you were just a person, if you were just a woman who had been dragged from her home, then my revenge wasn't justice. It was just cruelty." Rowan's breath hitched. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a defensive barrier. "Words are cheap, Kaelin, especially from a man who is bleeding on my bed." "I know," he agreed readily. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. You walked into a blizzard because death was better than looking at my face. That is a failure I will carry until the earth takes me." He slowly reached toward the small table beside the cot. His fingers brushed against a piece of jagged, blackened iron. It was a shard from a shattered horseshoe, sharp as a razor. "What are you doing?" Rowan asked, her posture stiffening. "What I should have done the day you arrived at the iron hold," Kaelin said. He gripped the iron shard in his right hand. He didn't hesitate. He dragged the sharp edge across his left palm, slicing deep into the flesh. Blood welled up instantly, dark and thick. Rowan stood up, her eyes wide. "Kaelin, stop!" "I, Kaelin of the Iron Hold," he chanted, his voice dropping into the ancient, resonant timbre of the old rituals. The air in the room grew heavy, vibrating with raw magic. "Alpha of the Northern Reaches, do hereby sever the blood tie." "No," Rowan whispered, taking a step forward. "I release Rowan of the Southern Valleys from all vows," Kaelin continued, his eyes locked onto hers. The grey in his irises was stormy, swirling with absolute conviction. "I release her from my name, I release her from my pack. She is bound to no one. She is property to no one. He slammed his bleeding hand against the wooden headboard. A sharp, audible snap echoed in the room. It sounded like a thick rope breaking under immense tension. Rowan gasped, clutching her chest. The heavy, invisible weight that had anchored her to Kaelan, the mating bond forged in blood and forced duty, dissolved. She was free, entirely, terrifyingly free. Kaelan dropped the iron shard. He leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving, his face pale with exertion and blood loss. He looked at her, and for the first time, he offered a small, genuine smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was honest. "You're free, Rowan," he whispered. "No one will ever hunt you again. I will send word to the southern packs. You can go home, or you can stay here and pour ale. The choice is completely yours." Rowan stared at him. She felt the emptiness in her chest where the bond used to be. She had dreamed of this moment. She had prayed for it while freezing on the battlements of the Ironhold. But now that it was here, the silence in her soul felt entirely wrong. She watched Kaelan slowly push the blankets aside. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot, wincing as his boots hit the floorboards. He was struggling to stand, his hand pressing hard against his bandaged side. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "I'm leaving," Kaelan grunted, swaying slightly as he found his footing. "I promised I wouldn't drag you back. You have your life. I need to go back and clean out my pack. General Varg has some answering to do." He grabbed his heavy cloak from the chair, throwing it over his shoulders. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked at her again, he knew he would drop to his knees and beg, and he refused to cage her with his desperation. He walked to the heavy wooden door. He reached for the iron latch. "Kaelan." Her voice was soft. It wasn't the harsh bark of Cora, the barmaid. It was Rowan. He stopped, his hand resting on the metal latch. He closed his eyes. "You're an idiot," she said. He heard her footsteps, slow, deliberate. She stopped right behind him. The scent of rain and wildflowers washed over him, completely enveloping him. "I am," he agreed, his voice hoarse. "You severed the bond without asking what I wanted," she continued. "You always make the decisions. You always assume you know best." "I gave you freedom," he whispered. "You gave me an out," she corrected. She reached past him, her hand covering his on the iron latch. Her skin was warm, rough with calluses, and incredibly strong. "But what if I don't want an out anymore?" Kaelan froze. He slowly turned his head. Rowan was looking up at him. The cold, impenetrable ice that had shielded her eyes for months was gone. She looked exhausted, battered by life, but fiercely, wonderfully alive. "I am not going back to the Ironhold as a treaty," Rowan said, her voice steady and commanding. "I am not going back as property, and if Lyra so much as breathes in my direction, I will throw her off the eastern battlements." Kaelan's breath hitched. A spark of genuine, disbelieving hope flared in his chest. "Rowan, if I go back," she said, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. "I go back as an equal. I go back as queen. And you will never, ever lock a door on me again." Kaelan turned fully toward her. He looked down at the woman who had survived a war, a blizzard, and his own catastrophic pride. She wasn't a prize to be won. She was a partner to be earned. He dropped to his knees. The movement tore at his stitches, but he didn't care. He knelt on the rough wooden floorboards, bowing his head before her. He took her calloused, blood-stained hand in both of his and pressed his forehead against her knuckles. "My equal," Kaelan swore, his voice trembling with absolute reverence. "My queen. My life." Rowan looked down at the Alpha King, kneeling in the dirt of a tannery room, stripped of his arrogance and bound only by his own choice. She gently pulled her hand free, reaching out to tangle her fingers in his ash-colored hair, holding him there in the quiet space between them. The war was finally over. The real reign had just begun. Rowan didn't just survive the winter. She conquered the king who brought it. Their story proves that true power isn't about breaking someone else. It's about having the strength to rebuild together when the walls finally come crashing down. If Kaelin and Rowan's journey from bitter revenge to a hard-earned, equal reign kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video with a fellow romance lover. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more grounded, fierce werewolf storytelling. Let us know in the comments, would you have given Kaelin a second chance?